The air in the great hall tasted like old iron and wet fur, vibrating with a low, predatory hum that made my skin crawl. I shouldn't have been able to read the symbols on the forbidden scroll. The ink was made of crushed bone and dried before the first kingdom fell. But the words didn't just sit on the parchment, they screamed in my blood. I looked up, my hands trembling, as I held the weight of 2 centuries of secrets, and saw them. 200 wolves, their eyes glowing like dying embers in the dark. They weren't moving to attack, they were falling. One by one, the most ruthless predators in the territory dropped to their knees, heads bowed so low their foreheads touched the stone, exposing their throats in a silent, terrifying plea for mercy. I was just a human translator with a $50 debt and a broken satchel, but in this room, I was the only one holding the leash. And the Lycan King, standing at the center of the carnage, wasn't looking at the scroll. He was looking at me like I was the one who had finally broken him. The great hall of the Morcant Stronghold didn't just smell of ancient stone, it smelled of waiting. 200 pairs of eyes, amber, silver, and the deep dark gold of the Lycan lineage, tracked my every move as I walked toward the pedestal. I wasn't a warrior. I wasn't even a citizen. I was a human translator with ink stains on my thumbs and a $50 debt to a local tavern owner that felt like a death sentence until the king's men had dragged me here. The forbidden scroll sat on a slab of black obsidian. It looked like a living thing, the parchment pulsing with a faint rhythmic heat that matched the beating of my own heart. Behind me, in the Lycan King, Draven stood like a statue carved from shadow and grief. He hadn't spoken to me in 3 days, not since he'd ordered his guards to bring me the one who speaks the dead tongue. I reached out. My fingers brushed the surface of the scroll, and a jolt of electricity, sharp and freezing, shot up my arm. The room went so silent I could hear the snowfall hitting the roof hundreds of feet above us. "Read it," Draven commanded. His voice was a low growl that vibrated in the soles of my feet. He didn't say, "Please, kings don't ask." I unrolled the first inch. The symbols were jagged, like teeth. Most people saw gibberish, but to me they shifted into a language that felt more natural than English. It was the covenant of the first moon, the law that had been lost for 3 centuries. As I spoke the first syllable, they must sound like a distant thunderclap echoed through the hall. "Solvunga! Malkortha!" The reaction was instantaneous. 200 elite werewolves, the fiercest warriors of the Northern Territories, didn't snarl. They didn't lunge. One by one, they collapsed. It wasn't a choice, it was a physical breaking. Their knees hit the stone with a sickening series of thuds. Necks that could snap iron pipes suddenly bent, heads bowing until their foreheads touched the cold floor. They were exposing their throats. To me, a human girl who had skipped breakfast because she couldn't afford the bread. I stopped. The air felt heavy, saturated with a power I didn't understand. I looked at Draven. For the first time, the king looked terrified. "What does the next line say?" he whispered, in his own knees trembling as he fought the urge to join his pack on the floor. I looked back at the scroll. The ink was glowing now, a deep blood red. "It says the translator isn't a guest," I whispered, my voice cracking. "It says the translator is the cage." Silence in the great hall was no longer a lack of noise. It was a physical pressure, like being underwater. 200 warriors remained paralyzed. Their vulnerability, the soft pale skin of their throats, offered up to me as if I were their executioner. I looked down at my hands. They were stained with the ink of a dozen dead languages, but they were shaking so violently I had to grip the edges of the obsidian pedestal to stay upright. "Get up," I whispered. My voice didn't carry. "They can't," Draven said. He had moved. He was now only inches away, the scent of cedar and old blood radiating from him. He wasn't bowing, but his muscles were corded with a strain so intense I could hear his bones creaking. He was fighting the magic of the scroll with every ounce of his alpha strength. The Covenant isn't a suggestion, Translator. It's a command written into our marrow. He reached out, his large, calloused hand hovering near the scroll. What did you do to them? I didn't do anything. I just read the words, I snapped, my fear finally turning into a spark of defensive anger. You're the one who dragged me here. You're the one who told me this was just an old tax record from the First Era. I lied, Draven growled, his eyes flashing a dangerous, molten gold. I needed to know if the rumors were true. And they said a human lived in the slums who could speak the primal tongue without their lungs bursting. I didn't think you'd be a girl who looks like a stiff breeze could knock her over. I felt the familiar sting of being underestimated. It was the same look the tavern owner gave me when I couldn't pay for my stew. I straightened my back, ignoring the way my heart hammered against my ribs. Well, the girl who looks like a stiff breeze just put your entire army on their knees, I said, my voice gaining strength. I looked back at the scroll. The red glow was fading into a steady, rhythmic pulse. The scroll says that when the cage speaks, the hounds must listen. It's not a tax record, Draven. It's a contract. And according to this, you've been out of compliance for 300 years. Draven's hand finally dropped, and he couldn't fight it anymore. He didn't fall to his knees like the others, but he bowed his head, his dark hair falling forward to hide his expression. The debt is due, he muttered, the words sounding like a curse. What debt? I asked, a cold dread pooling in my stomach. He looked up, and for a split second, the king vanished. In his eyes, I saw a man who had been carrying a mountain for too long. The debt of blood. The scroll doesn't just grant power to the translator, it binds the pact to the speaker's soul. If you die, we die. If you bleed, we bleed. He took a step closer, invading my personal space until I was backed against the cold obsidian. You aren't just a translator anymore, Sharon. You're the most dangerous person in this kingdom. And half the people in this room will want to kill you the moment they find a way to break that seal. I looked at the 200 wolves. Some were shifting, their claws scraping the stone in frustration, but their throats remained exposed. They hated me, they feared me, and now they were tied to me. I just wanted to pay my $50 debt, I whispered to the empty air. Your old life ended the moment you opened that parchment, Draven said, his voice dropping to a silk-wrapped threat. Now read the next page. Tell me how we survive this. The sound of 200 hearts beating in unison was a drum low in my chest. They were still down, paralyzed by the ancient syntax I'd just unleashed. My throat felt raw, as if the words themselves had been made of glass. Get them up, Draven hissed. Though he was standing so close I could see the golden rings around his pupils tightening. If they stay like this too long, the pack bond will fracture. They'll go feral. I don't know how, I yelled back, my voice echoing off the high vaulted ceiling. There's no undo button in the margins, Draven. I'm reading phonetically. I don't even know what I'm saying half the time. The king's hand shot out, grabbing my wrist. His skin was burning, a feverish Lycan heat that made my breath hitch. Then find it. Or I swear, Sharon, the debt you owe the tavern will be the least of your worries. I looked down at the scroll. The symbols were shifting again. They weren't teeth anymore. They were liquid, flowing like spilled wine across the parchment. I saw a phrase I recognized from a fragment of a text I'd found in the slums 3 years ago. Like Ammon, rise. The effect was like a string being cut. The heavy, oppressive magic snapped. All at once, the 200 wolves gasped, air rushing back into their lungs as the physical weight lifted. They scrambled to their feet, the sound of leather and fur and boots against stone filling the hall like a wave. But they didn't look relieved, they looked humiliated. A massive wolf in the front row, a lieutenant with a scar running from his ear to his jaw, stepped forward. His eyes were fixed on me, filled with a pure, unadulterated loathing. You let a human silence us, the lieutenant, Silas, spat toward his king. You brought a gutter rat into the stronghold to humiliate the bloodline? Draven didn't flinch. He let go of my wrist, but he stepped in front of me, his massive frame shielding me from the pack's collective rage. She didn't humiliate you, Silas. The law did. She is simply the voice the law chose. The law is dead, Silas roared, his hands curling into claws. We haven't seen a cage speaker in 3 centuries. She's a trick, a human sorceress sent by the southern borders to weaken us. The pack began to murmur, a low growl rippling through the ranks. They were closing in. I could smell the ozone of a pending shift, the electricity that precedes a werewolf turning. My legs felt like lead. I was trapped between a pedestal holding a weapon I didn't understand and a king who was the only thing keeping me from being torn apart. She stays, Draven said, his voice dropping into that terrifying, quiet register that meant someone was about to die. And the next person who calls her a gutter rat will find out exactly why I am the one wearing the crown. He turned back to me, his eyes searching mine. For a second, the mask of the king slipped. He looked desperate. Can you read the rest, the part about the bloodbind? I looked at the scroll. I could feel it calling to me, a low hum in my marrow. I can, I whispered. But Draven, if I read this, there's no going back. The scroll says that once the bind is spoken, the speaker and the king are 2 halves of the same soul. A soft domestic silence fell over the immediate space between us, despite the angry pack behind him. He reached out, his thumb brushing a smudge of ink off my cheek. I've been half a soul for a long time, Sharon, he said softly. Finish it. The air in the hall turned from cold iron to thick, suffocating honey. I could feel the eyes of the 200 warriors burning into my back, a mixture of awe, resentment, and primal fear. Draven didn't move. He stood like a mountain waiting for the first crack of dawn. Read it, Sharon, he repeated. His voice was no longer a command, it was an invitation to a cliff's edge. I turned back to the forbidden scroll. The liquid ink began to swirl faster, forming a circle that looked like a dark, dilated pupil. My vision blurred at the edges, the world narrowing down to the parchment and the man standing beside me. Ancora, Vas, Terum. As I spoke the words, a searing heat ignited in my chest. It wasn't pain, it was a tether. I felt a sharp, phantom sting in my palm, and I looked down to see a thin, glowing line of red light slicing across my skin. On the other side of the pedestal, Draven winced. He held up his hand. A matching mark was opening on his palm, bleeding gold light instead of red blood. The bind is taking, he whispered, his face pale but his eyes fixed on mine with a terrifying intensity. The 200 wolves behind us let out a collective, mournful howl, not of aggression, but of recognition. They could feel it too. Their alpha was being woven into the soul of a human girl who smelled of cheap ink and rain. Silas, the scarred lieutenant, took a step forward, his claws leaving deep gouges in the stone floor. This is sacrilege. You are tying the fate of the Great North to a creature who could die from a common fever. Silence! Draven's voice exploded through the hall, the power of the bind amplifying his alpha roar until the stained glass in the high windows rattled in their lead frames. He turned his head just enough to look at Silas over his shoulder. She is no longer a creature, she is the anchor. If she dies, I die. If I die, you all fall into the madness of the moonless night. You will protect her as you protect your own hearts. I felt a wave of Draven's emotions wash over me through the link, raw, jagged edges of loneliness, a heavy sense of duty, and a sudden blooming spark of protectiveness that made my own heart race. My body felt light, my senses sharpening, until I could hear the heartbeat of the smallest wolf in the back row. The scroll began to roll itself shut, the magic receding back into the ancient bone ink. The glow in the room faded, leaving us in the flickering amber light of the torches. Draven stepped around the pedestal. He reached out and took my hand, the one with the glowing mark. His touch was no longer just heat, it was a homecoming. "The ritual is incomplete," I whispered, the knowledge flowing into my mind from the scroll's lingering echo. "There's one more part. The mark doesn't just bind our souls, Draven, it demands a sacrifice of the old life." "I already gave that up when I brought you here," he said, pulling me closer until my forehead rested against his chest. For the first time, he smelled not of blood, but of the forest after a storm. Behind us, Silas snarled, but he didn't move. He couldn't. The bind had turned me into something holy and untouchable in their eyes, even if their hearts still hungered for my blood. "I still owe $50 to that tavern," I muttered into his tunic, the mundane reality of my past life clashing with the mythic weight of my present. Draven let out a short and dark laugh that vibrated through my entire being. "I'll buy the tavern, Sharon. I'll buy the whole town. Just don't stop reading." The Great Hall was no longer a place of worship or law. It had become a pressure cooker of resentment. Silas, the scarred lieutenant, didn't move. He stood in the center of the aisle, his chest heaving, his eyes darting between my hand and the king's throat. He was the physical embodiment of the pack's pride, and that pride had just been trampled by a girl who owned one dress and a bag of ink-stained quills. "You chose a human," Silas whispered, the sound more dangerous than a roar. "You tied our life force to a pulse so weak a child could stop it." Draven didn't let go of my hand. If anything, his grip tightened, his thumb tracing the glowing mark on my skin, a gesture that was half possession, half protection. I didn't choose her, Silas. The law did, and if you have a grievance with the law, take it up with the scroll. He looked at me, his gaze softening in a way that made the room feel suddenly, jarringly small. "Are you tired?" I'm fine," I lied. My knees were actually vibrating, the adrenaline of the ritual finally ebbing away to leave a bone-deep exhaustion. "She's swaying," Silas mocked, a cruel smile twisting his scarred face. "Our anchor can barely stand on her own 2 feet. What happens when the southern packs hear our king is guarded by a girl who needs a nap?" Draven's eyes flashed. In one movement, too fast for my human eyes to track, he was across the space. He didn't shift. He didn't need to. He grabbed Silas by the throat and slammed him against a pillar with a crack that echoed like a gunshot. "Wait, the next word you speak about her," Draven growled, his face inches from his lieutenant's, "will be the last word you ever speak. Do you understand? She is not a girl. She is the speaker. And you will treat her with more reverence than you treat the moon itself." Silas choked out a gasp of agreement, his eyes wide with the realization that the king's power hadn't just remained, it had been sharpened by the bind. Draven dropped him like trash and turned back to me. The violence vanished from his face, replaced by that unsettling, quiet focus. He walked back to me, scooped me up into his arms as if I weighed nothing, and began to walk toward the private chambers behind the throne. "I can walk," I protested, though I was already leaning my head against his shoulder. He smelled like winter and something ancient. "You've done enough today," he said. His voice was low, for my ears only. We reached his private solar, a room filled with heavy furs, the scent of cedar, and stacks of old books that made my translator's heart skip a beat. He set me down on a large, plush chair near the fireplace. For a moment, the king was gone. He was just a man. He knelt by the fire, poking the embers until a warm glow filled the room. "Why me?" I asked, watching the firelight dance in his dark hair. "There must be scholars in the capital, priests, people who know how to handle magic." Draven didn't look up. "Because you didn't want it," he said simply. "The others would have used the scroll to rule. You just wanted to pay your debt and go home." He stood up and walked over, handing me a glass of dark, sweet wine. Our fingers brushed, and a spark of the bind flickered between us, a warm, comforting hum. You can't go back to that slum, Sharon, not ever, he said, his voice dropping to a soft, domestic tone. But I promise you this, you will never be hungry again, you will never be afraid, and that $50? I've already sent a rider, the tavern owner now works for you. I looked at him, the Lycan King, the monster of the north, and realized that the forbidden scroll hadn't just exposed the throats of the wolves, it had exposed his heart. The warmth of the fireplace in Draven's chambers was a lie. While the king sat beside me, his fingers tracing the glowing bind on my hand, the air outside was screaming with the scent of betrayal. Through our link, I felt it first, a sudden sharp spike of cold adrenaline. It wasn't mine, it was his. Draven stood up before the door even burst open. Silas didn't come alone. He had 10 of the king's own guard with him, their eyes clouded with a dark, unnatural grey mist, the mark of a forbidden moon hex. The law is old, Draven, but the blood is older, Silas snarled, his claws fully extended, dripping with a black ichor. We won't be ruled by a human's heartbeat. We'll kill her, and when the bind breaks, we'll see if you're strong enough to survive the shock. I scrambled back into the heavy fur of the chair, my heart hammering against my ribs. The $50 debt I'd worried about hours ago felt like a memory from a different life. This was the precipice. Stay behind me, Draven commanded. One word, absolute. He didn't shift into a wolf, he didn't have to. The bind pulsed, and a golden aura erupted around him, in a physical manifestation of the power I had unlocked from the scroll. He moved like a blur of shadow and light, meeting the first 3 guards in a collision that shook the stone walls. But Silas was smart. He didn't go for the king. He waited for the gap. As Draven threw a guard through the heavy oak table, Silas lunged at me. His eyes were wide, filled with a crazed obsession to return to the old ways. His claw reached for my throat, the same throat his brothers had exposed to me in fear only an hour before. No, I screamed. I didn't have a weapon, I didn't have claws, but I had the language. Vashkar! The word didn't come from my throat, it came from the glowing mark on my palm. A shockwave of pure white energy exploded outward. It hit Silas like a physical wall, throwing him backward across the room until he hit the black obsidian pedestal I'd used earlier. The room went silent. The enchanted guards dropped to their knees, the grey mist clearing from their eyes as the hex was shattered by the primal tongue. Draven turned, his chest heaving, blood, both red and gold, dripping from his knuckles. He looked at Silas, who lay broken against the stone. Then he looked at me. You protected the pack, he whispered, awe blooming in the bond between us. I protected you, I corrected, my voice trembling as the glow on my hand began to fade. Draven walked over to Silas. He didn't kill him, not yet. He looked down at the lieutenant who had sought to humiliate us both. You wanted to see if the human was weak, Draven said, his voice a low, terrifying rumble. But you forgot one thing, Silas. And the cage doesn't just hold the wolves in, it keeps the monsters out. And she is the only reason I haven't torn your heart out myself. He gestured to the guards who were now coming to their senses. Take him to the silver cells. He will watch from behind bars as this human leads us into the new era. Draven turned back to me, his expression shifting from a warlord to a man who had finally found his North Star. He reached out, his hand trembling slightly as he touched my face. Are you hurt? Only my pride, I said, a small shaky smile breaking through the fear. And maybe my lungs. That word. It felt like breathing fire. You are the fire, Sharon, he said, pulling me into a kiss that tasted of iron and destiny. And the whole world is about to get very, very warm. The aftermath of the ambush left the great hall smelling of scorched stone and the metallic tang of broken magic. Draven didn't call for his servants to clean the mess. He did it himself, his large hands surprisingly gentle as he cleared the debris away from the obsidian pedestal. Every few seconds, his eyes would flick to me, checking the bond, ensuring my pulse was still steady. "The southern packs are already sending messengers," he said, his voice back to its short, authoritative clip. "They heard the scream of the primal tongue. They know the cage is occupied." I looked down at the $50 tavern debt notice I had kept in my pocket, a crumpled piece of paper that represented my old life of fear and scarcity. I walked to the fireplace and tossed it into the embers. I watched the ink curl and blacken until the debt was nothing but ash. "I'm not going back, Draven," I said, my voice finally firm. He stopped what he was doing and walked toward me. The king, who had spent years being dead inside, now looked more alive than the fire behind me. He reached out, his hand resting protectively on the small of my back, a gesture of public claim and private tenderness. "You were never meant for the slums, Sharon. You were the missing verse in our history," he whispered. A month later, the great hall was filled again, but this time there was no fear, no forced bowing. Silas was gone, locked in the silver cells to watch the world change without him. As I walked through the center aisle, 200 wolves didn't expose their throats in terror. They stood tall, their hands over their hearts in a gesture of absolute loyalty. I reached the throne, where Draven waited. He wasn't wearing his crown. He held it in his hands. He placed the gold band on my head, his fingers lingering against my temple. "The translator has finished the book," he announced to the room, his voice echoing with the power of our shared soul. "Now we begin the sequel." I looked out at the pack, the people who were now my blood and my burden. I wasn't just a human anymore, I was the bridge. Draven leaned closer to my ear, his breath warm. "Seems like the scroll was right," he whispered. "Love cures what magic can't." Thank you so much for staying with me until the end of this story. If you enjoyed seeing Sharon turn from a debtor to a queen, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. It really helps the channel grow. Now, I have to ask you, if you were in Sharon's shoes and found out you held the power to control an entire werewolf army, would you stay with the king or take the power for yourself? Drop your answer in the comments. I read every single one and I can't wait to hear what you think.